But now we're going to listen to our third speaker, and that's Allison Dring. And Allison Dring is founder of Elegant Embellishments. And I think that's the most beautiful title. Also, Allison is the co-director and founder of Elegant Embellishments. And Elegant Embellishments is a research and design manufacturing studio that advises buildings to perform in an environmentally friendly way with aesthetic building products. So an example that the company is working on is a smoke-eating facade, or actually smoke-eating facade panels to combat the effects of pollution in cities. So today, Allison is going to give a talk on the developments of this CO2 absorbing facade and the influence of intelligent architecture on its environment. So Allison, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having me. I'd like to start with something you're probably all really familiar with. This is, of course, BIM. And this is an image of a rendering made with BIM. And for those of you that aren't familiar, it's a software for building information module. I think that's what it stands for. Correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, the thing I find really interesting about BIM is that it reveals so much to us about what's going on in our buildings. And it goes beyond aesthetics, which is kind of really interesting for an architect. And what this reveals to me is how technological the insides of our buildings actually are. We have so much control over performance. We have control over things like air movement and data and materiality, water, etc., waste. But when we leave the building's envelope and go outside, we're left in chaos. We're left to things like air pollution, traffic, weather systems. This is a highly active, volatile environment. And you'll notice this is Beijing, by the way. If you haven't seen this picture, it's really famous. You have Rem Koolhaas's CCTV building there. But the thing you're really looking at right now is the air pollution. And that's because it is a highly architectural condition. And yet the architecture in this image is completely ignoring it. So the components of air pollution, there are many. And you're going to hear about mainly the ones that are the most harmful. And that's the ones I'm going to talk about now. And the first one is NOx. And there are others too which are harmful, but NOx is the one that comes directly from traffic. So we're talking about pollution from cars. And NOx is the thing that will cause early asthma. It's precursors to cancer. It's really the killer component. And this is a technology that was invented in 2001. And it basically uses only sunlight to convert NOx into a harmless substance, which is a calcium nitrate. And it's based on a nano version of titanium dioxide, and it's a photocatalyst. And the way that it was presented when I found it in 2005 was as a coating. And it's basically a white paint. And it looks like this. And so when I found it, I thought, well, that's a formless technology. And it was aimed toward architecture. They really wanted this product to be the thing that we would coat our cities in and that could reduce air pollution. And indeed it is. It's actually that effective. But the problem I found with it is, first of all, you have air pollution, and it's this invisible problem. And how hard is that? You apply a sort of invisible solution. And so when we first came across this as architects, we thought this thing needs some form. And we also started to wonder about how effective it could be if we increased its surface enlargement, if we increased its surface. So we started to develop a substrate for this that could improve its efficacy and start to develop an aesthetic for it that people could recognize. And so in the biological world, there's this link between light and complex surfaces. And these are corals. And I use this image a lot because it has a kind of surface complexity because it needs it. It needs to be able to get light on an ocean floor in order to photosynthesize. And so we started to think in an architectural setting, could we use surface enlargement to actually increase the amount of light we could get onto the surface using this technology? And then could we get an aesthetic that had to do with surface complexity and put it on a building? So this is ProSolve, and this is a facade module we developed and manufacture. And it uses only sunlight to reduce air pollution in cities. And basically what it does, it takes this technology that normally you would just coat a city in, and it clusters it on an architectural facade, which is important because this is really where pollution can be like really dense. And so you have hot spots in cities that are kind of clustered around facades. So that's me in 2006, and this is how we started. And I was an architect, and I thought, you know, this is my partner and I, we wanted to make this thing. And in the world of manufacturing, this isn't going to happen. In construction, you have flat panels. You have a kind of very big companies doing very big things with facades. And so to put something three-dimensional and made of plastic in front of a construction manufacturer, it wasn't going to happen. So the first prototypes we made, we hand cast ourselves. We made about 300 parts. And we made them in like a friend's warehouse in London in 2006. And we put them up, and we tested them, and they came out really great. And we started to think about, well, if we can make 300, why can't we make 3,000? So we scaled up over the years, and we thought about things like how to shape the design so that it would work with the technology. So we started to look at surface enlargement and omnidirectionality of light and things like slowing the, slowing the wind speed down so that it would collect pollution in a better way. And these are some full-scale prototypes that we made in Ulm. So we started to work with producers at this point. This wasn't like in the back of a warehouse somewhere anymore. And in 2012, we put it on a building. And so this is a hospital in Mexico City. And it's basically a solar shade. And it's 2,500 square meters. And according to studies of the technology, it's reducing the air pollution of about 1,000 cars per day. So some other views of it. This is from the back. It's yeah, it's quite effective, and I think it has a real aesthetic. I think people on the ground, I'm not sure they know exactly what it's doing, but it definitely has an identity now. And air pollution in Mexico City is a big topic. People tend to know a lot about it, about the problem. So I think it makes sense to put it there. This is a new project. This is the same geometries, but we're starting to look at doing a double curvature. And we're also starting to integrate the structure, the support structure, into the modules themselves. And this is in Ivory Coast, and it'll be on site next month, I hope. So in our practice, we get a little obsessed with air and what's in our air. And specifically, we look at things like air pollution. But we've also lately started to look at global warming. And in this, I want to make the distinction between pollution, which is NOx and from the ground, from the cars, and carbon dioxide, which is in the atmosphere. Has anyone here read The Martian? Or knows the movie? Okay, I watched the movie too. When I was reading the book, it was in 2015, and this is COP21 was happening at the same time. And I started to really think about, I mean, these two things had so many parallels for me. And the biggest one was that in The Martian, he was always dealing with scarcity. And he was always trying to precipitate materials from his atmosphere to stay alive. And I thought, wow, this really sounds like global warming. This is like what we're talking about at COP21. And so I started to think about, are the solutions that he's coming up with on another planet going to be the solutions we need to have on our own planet in 50 years or even now? So what can you make from the air? And these are two technologies that are looking at exactly that. And this one here is Fontes. They're a startup in Austria, I think. And they're actually precipitating water from H2O, from oxygen. So you ride your bike and the water bottle can precipitate water while you ride, and then you have drinking water. And the other one here is New Light Technologies, and they're looking at methane emissions, and they're actually capturing methane emissions and converting it into a commercial plastic. So they're starting to produce things like plastic bags for Dell. And this is all super interesting for us because what's in our air? Like when we talk about global warming, what are we actually talking about? Well, it's CO2. And CO2 is actually just carbon. So basically the history of carbon globally for us is that we took all the carbon from our ground, we burned it, and now it's up in the air, and we can't get it back down. We can lower our emissions, we can slow it down, but what do we do with the air the carbon that's already in our air? And for us, we thought, well, it's a material, it's carbon. Why isn't this a resource for us? So you can look at this, and it might look a little complex, maybe not, but you can also look at it as a kind of past, present, and future scenario. And this is referred to as our carbon flux. So here you have carbon positive, and I'm going to call it our carbon positive past. And this is that we have relied on things like coal and gas. We've taken them from our subterraneous levels, we've burned them, and now they're in our atmosphere. So this is our problem. Some people would say we're living in a carbon neutral present, and that's that we don't rely on the subterraneous carbon, but we rely on other energy systems. So we're going to keep the carbon in the atmosphere. It's going to keep circulating. And I want to show you today a possible carbon negative future. And this is an idea about taking the carbon that's already in our skies, mining it, drawing it down, and putting it back in the subterraneous level where it should go. So this is an idea not using any advanced technology. It's very basic technology. It's actually photosynthesis. So any biological material in its lifetime absorbs CO2. But when that plant or tree dies, it releases the CO2 back into the atmosphere. And what we want to do is take that plant material and burn it or bake it in a kind of controlled way. And what we get out of that process is a stable form of carbon char. And this form of carbon, which is here, these small granulates, this is actually 50% carbon, and we can put it back in the earth. So it's a kind of locked, it's a kind of greenhouse gases that are locked in a material. So cities, how does this scale up? Cities are this great test bed for carbon because there's so many kinds of structures and there's so much diversity in cities that we start to look at what's the future of cities with building. So we know that our population is going to increase. We know that we're going to go up to 9.7 billion people. And we also know that just to house an housing and infrastructure for that population increase is going to release 350 gigatons of carbon into our atmosphere. And this is all by 2050. So what is 350 gigatons of carbon? Does anyone know? It's a really big number, and it's really hard to explain. That's a trick question. It's more, the fact is that if we emit 350 gigatons of carbon by 2050, you can throw away the COP21 agreement. It means that we won't be able to avert any disaster scenario in global warming. It's kind of the end of days. And this is all based on, we will emit this much because we build in the way that we do now. So we started to think about, what is this material we're building with? What's our architecture actually doing? Why is it so inert? Why can't the architecture start to be more interactive? Why are we building with such dumb materials? The construction industry accounts for 30 to 40% of the world's production of stuff. It's the largest production or like material producing industry in the world. So we thought, if you could get a process that's carbon negative, even 10% into the construction industry, could we be looking at a different future? So this is a prototype of a material. Actually, this is a pancake of a compound. That's a carbon negative material using this stable form of carbon char. And we formed an initiative around it called Made of Air. And basically what we're doing is looking at how you can lock greenhouse gases into architecture. So this is a material composed of basically atmospheric carbon and some biodegradable binders. And we're able to get a kind of plasticky material. And it's very good. It's made of waste. And if you were to shred this material and put it back in the earth, it would be very good for the earth. So as architects, you know, we wanted this material, by the way, to like go everywhere. We looked at it and we thought, that needs to be in concrete. We need to be making walls. We need to be doing everything with that. But we're architects, and we're just one company. So we started looking at facades, which is what we do. And right now we're developing 2 different facades using this material. And one has a lot to do with being very ubiquitous, going on any building that we can. And the other has to do with being more design aesthetic, getting interested in showing the material and what it can do. So this is a prototype of the hex char one. They're hexagons, and you can reverse them to be able to get kind of randomness in the facade. At the moment, we're self-producing them, and we're in material tests. They have very good material properties. It's very, it's not brittle. It doesn't break. It feels, I don't know how to describe it. It doesn't feel cheap. It feels heavy. It feels a little like a ceramic, but a soft, plasticky one. And they have very good fire properties. They're compressed. You can compress them. You can extrude them. You can, they're conductive. We're just finding out all kinds of things. We're trying to print with them in 3D printers. So there's a lot of potential in this. But we're starting with this, with a facade, and we should be through material testing in the next couple of months. So just to give it some scale, at about 1,000 square meters, we're sequestering 10 tons of atmospheric CO2. And at 1,000 square meters, you're looking at the equivalent of the CO2 emissions of about 25 people per year. And then some research we're doing in the studio about acoustic properties and about how you could get like a CO2 max in the material. And so in our practice, we tend to look a lot at these 2 metrics. And energy, I think, is something that we've been hearing about before with the edge, and we'll be hearing a lot more about. There's a lot of attention on the energy metric in buildings. And basically what you want is a building to produce more energy than it uses. And what we're saying is we also want a building to reduce more CO2 than it produces. So we're talking about an energy positive and a carbon negative building future. I think the question for us is, can we, if we're living in a period where software is kind of, we're in like the future when we talk about software. Why is materials so traditional? And why can't our architecture start to do things like this? And if we get these metrics right, the best thing we could do in our cities is build. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. It was truly inspiring. I think everyone agrees. We were just talking about your project out earlier, and I said, I cannot believe that this has not already been bought by every company in the Netherlands, or why the government doesn't implement it yet. Why is it so difficult?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the biggest challenge, the one we were talking about before, is that it's unlike the energy scenario, where the building owner is thinking about the metrics in his building, about how happy his workforce is, for example, and what his maintenance looks like over time. It all has to do with being inside that envelope. And when you start to look at air pollution, it's really not the responsibility of a building owner, or they don't feel responsible for the space in front of their building. In fact, it's a kind of civic space. So I think it's a hard sell. It's hard to get clients to say, okay, I'm going to spend the money and I'm going to produce something that will help the city.
Yeah.
And there isn't much incentive from city policymakers at the moment to do that.
All right. Yeah, well, that should be there. It's a good investment, I think. Also, the last thing you said about your project, and I thought that was also, I watched your TED talk, of course, and I was also thinking about the concept smart, and then I thought, well, your project is smart in an entirely different way than we now probably think about smart. If we talk about smart cities, we instantly think about software, and you shift the focus back to the material. So what is your own view on smart cities? Or
yeah, it's a good question. I don't have a completely formed opinion about smart. For me, it's these materials are really smart, but they're inactive. Or in effect, the air pollution one is active, but the carbon one is not. And I think that it's totally depending on which perspective you have on smart. I don't think everything has to be digital and connected. In fact, I think some of the very molecular makeup of our materials can be smart. And that's something that we have to start looking at scientists more. We have to start engaging scientists in architecture. And I don't think that's happening as much. It's not as easy to do.
Right. Okay. Well, are there any questions from the audience for Allison? Yeah.
Well, I do have, maybe it's a bit more technical, but I heard that storing those substances you talk about, so maybe CO2 or NOx, storing them in a container can be very lethal if it breaks open, for example. Why is that different by putting it in materials?
Well, CO2, I think you mean because it's a gas?
Okay, yeah.
Storage, I think in this process, it's really never a gas. It's sort of absorbed into the plant material, and then it's kind of a material already, so it's a solid. And in that burning or baking, where it gets converted into carbon, it only releases water. It's like a water vapor. So it's really a safe thing. It's actually, it's a pretty common thing to do now. There are a lot of people doing it in their backyards. It's a kind of waste management system.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Yeah, in the back.
So those 50% of carbon you had left, are you also using those 50% to make your hexagon carbon forms? Was it the same 50% or?
No.
Okay.
It's really hard to explain. We have a formula, and there's a certain amount, a majority of the amount that uses the char that we have, and of that char, there's 50% is atmospheric carbon. So there are other components, but when you get to the end of the cycle, you are in carbon negative. So the carbon balance is negative.
Okay, and then I have a second question, because putting those carbon in the ground, is it bad for the ground itself? Because you see in agriculture, if you're using the same ground to produce potatoes, you can't produce potatoes again and again, because then same stuff will be in the ground like for years, and then the ground will be poisonous or not good for potatoes anymore. Is that the same with storing carbon in the ground?
You know, the technology behind this, if you want to call it tech, it comes from the agriculture industry. So actually what they're already doing with this carbon char is shredding it and putting it on fields. It has a higher yield every year. It has like a certain amount of selenium, which is good for fields. So that's kind of how it developed. That's on the surface, but you have a good question about sequestration. So if we're really going to bury this stuff into the earth, how it affects the farming field, I'm not sure. Right now it would go into a landfill. And whereas usually we don't want anything going in the landfill. With this we do, because it gets buried deep and it's kind of going back to where it came from.
Yeah, but in a different form.
In a different form.
Yeah. That maybe has some question marks to it, I think.
Yeah, that I haven't heard. I mean, a lot of the proposals I've heard have to do with burying it under granite. So it seems to be the safest option, but right now we have landfills and that's how we handle waste, and this is the better alternative for that.
Yeah, one more question? Okay. No, if I can reach you. See. Yeah.
Yeah, so you produce these plates out of carbon. How do you actually win the carbon out of the air?
How do we collect it? You
Yeah,
mean?
how do you collect the carbon itself? Yeah.
Oh, the plants do all the work.
Okay.
We're not out there with...
So the plates are produced from the carbon you extract from the plants themselves.
Exactly.
Okay,
That's right.
cool.
Yeah,
No
very,
tools involved.
very cool. Okay, well, thank you so much, Allison. Oh, was there one more question? Yeah, of course.
You say not a lot of building owners implement your facades because they don't feel responsible for smog, because it's more of a public thing. How did you convince the people that did use your facade to start using it?
They came to us. I think that's the key thing. we were early on in prototypes. We had, and their building was taking a long time to build, so they kind of timed it really well with us. We were in conversation for about 3 years about air pollution. And the key thing behind that is that in Mexico City, everyone knows about air pollution. They know their problem. And that makes it super easy. The director of the hospital had support from the government. He had support from the people. And he knew that by doing something like this, it was immediately obvious what he was doing. And I think politicians got behind it. You know, it has a kind of waterfall effect. And I think in places like in Europe, for example, if people don't know the problem. People are walking around in polluted spaces, but they don't actually know what they're breathing. And that makes it really hard to convince people in Europe to say, let's do something about it, and the architecture should be part of that solution.
All right. Well, thanks so much for your talk. It was great. Yeah, give it up for Allison one more time.